Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So here I am on Queen Anne's Gate, London, outside the house where James Stuart Mill and his son John Stuart Mill both lived. So James Mill came from North Britain. He came down to London late in life. He was brought up in the Protestant denomination of Christianity, as most people in Scotland were. He was a fairly religious man. His son was less so. But he's best known for penning his 10-volume History of India, which he wrote in this house, despite never having visited India. So an exceptionally erudite man, largely autodidactic. And soon he was moving in London literary circles. He was inclined towards the Whig Party. He never sought public office himself, and he was a close friend of Jeremy Bentham, although Bentham was much older than him. And Bentham was actually a neighbour of theirs, so then John Stuart Mill was brought up knowing Bentham very well. Now, James Mill thought that most schools were dreadful and they would provide only a miseducation for his children. So perhaps it's an odd view, given that we're not half a mile from Westminster School, one of the most distinguished schools in the realm. Westminster School is like the most academically successful school in the United Kingdom, has a higher percentage of people going on to Oxford and Cambridge than any other school in the world, about 50%. Bear in mind that if you apply to Oxford and Cambridge, your chance of being admitted is about 20%. That is a fantastic result. Anyway, so John Stuart Mill was taught at home, and he was driven very hard indeed. As he said, he was brought up in the absence of love, so it was sort of like an academic battery farm, and he mastered several languages very early: Latin, ancient Greek, Hebrew. And when he was a teenager, if I got it right, he was 15, he wrote a treatise on logic, but just to make it a tiny bit challenging, he wrote it in French. So he was a polyglot and a polymath, had just dipped into almost any subject you could name and pursued them to the highest possible level, whether it was calculus or whether it was philosophy. But he's best known as a philosopher. And he made his living writing, but was afflicted by severe melancholy when he was only about 20. This disease of the learned, fell into depression. His nerves failed him. But anyway, he finally lifted out of that and found projects to entertain him. So he's best known for his work on liberty, defining what he considers liberty to be. So what rights should we have? Where do we come from? How do we know what they are? What role does government have? What's its source of legitimacy? Asking these sort of fundamental questions which are seldom asked. So tracing things back to first principles. So he later got involved in partisan politics. Part of his problem is he was just so brainy, he found it difficult to have the common touch, to speak to people in plain English, because he was using philosophical terminology that most people couldn't comprehend. Anyway, so he was a liberal, and indeed he denounced the Conservatives as the stupid party. Of course, there are plenty of very clever Conservatives. So his views were fascinating. He was the second ever member of Parliament to advocate granting the right to vote to women. And sort of in the mid-19th century, that was well ahead of its time. Mary Wollstonecraft had advocated that about 80 years earlier. Obviously, she didn't do it in Parliament because she was a woman. And if you go back to, say, the 1640s, there were some English women during the English Civil War who'd call for the same, and the Parliament told them to go home and meddle with their housewifery. So he was derided for the very suggestion that there ought to be female suffrage, as in women should be granted the right to vote. But he said, no, they're just as logical, and people say they're insufficiently educated, which is because you deprive them of education. It's not that they're inherently incapable of logical reasoning or exercising their cognitive functions. Yes, they're underdeveloped, but that's because you deny them the chance to develop these things. And there were some very learned women by this time. Obviously, Bedford College had been set up by that stage, the 1850s, on Bedford Square in London, the first third-level education institution for women in the United Kingdom. One of the first in the world. There were a few in the US prior to that. But John Stuart Mill was not entirely predictable. For instance, he was in favour of capital punishment. Now, capital punishment was uncontroversial at the time. Almost everybody agreed that it ought to exist. It just depends for which offences should the death penalty be imposed. And he only wanted it for murder and the gravest of offences. Remember, not so long ago, not so long before his time, the death penalty had been used very promiscuously. It was born in 1806, and until the 1820s, there was something like 200 capital offences in the United Kingdom, such as grand larceny, which could be stealing a wallet, stealing anything worth more than a few shillings. Let me see, robbery on a navigable river was punishable by death, but on a non-navigable river, it wasn't punishable by death. Forgery of any kind, punishable by death. Starting a fire in a Royal Naval dockyard, even if accidentally, was punishable by death. Blasphemy was punishable by death. Treason was punishable by death. I can't think. There are quite a few more of these things. Stealing a horse, no matter how low its value, was punishable by death, and on and on. So the number of offences for which people could be sent to the gallows was radically reduced. So he believed in being very rational, and said, well, really the deterrent effect, that was the thrust of his argument, because it would put people off committing murder and very grave crimes, because what's your alternative? You threaten them with imprisonment for life. And he said, well, that's not going to scare people. It shan't put a chill wind in their minds, the thought that they will be locked up in some dungeon with a very basic diet and very few pleasures in their life. That's really not scary enough. You must frighten them off doing this by knowing that they will be hanged if they commit this crime. So that's John Stuart Mill, a prolific writer on liberalism, and still fairly laissez-faire as it was in his day. The interventionist or collectivist side of liberalism came later. He was looking back to the Enlightenment, to the French Revolution, and then the precursors thereof, the physiocrats, the encyclopedists, really amassing knowledge. We have to make decisions on the basis of the truth, and not on the basis of emotion, or just blind tradition for its own sake. So you've got to know as much as you can, and he felt that conservatives were too hidebound by tradition. They opined on the basis of just their feelings, and they didn't find out what the situation really was. Anything else to add about Mill? Yeah, so that was him. Certainly a very odd character. That's enough about the Mill family just now.